Good morning, everybody. First, I would like to thank Jose Lebrero Stals, director of the Museo Picasso Málaga, who proposed the topic of Picasso in history and who very kindly invited me to collaborate in the planning for this conference. I also feel compelled to repeat some of the acknowledgments that he has already made to Ramon Melero Guirado and Begonia Mendoza Perez here at the Museo Picasso Málaga for their assiduous organizational work, to Eugenio Carmona, who just gave this wonderful lecture at the Universidad de Málaga, who was an essential participant in the shaping of the intellectual program for this conference, along with a multinational team, including Émilie Bouvard and Camille Frasca from the Museo Picasso Paris, and Malène Gual from the Museo Picasso Barcelona. And I should also mention Colline Zelal at the Museo Picasso Paris, who played an important role, an essential role in our organizational efforts, as have many other people working behind the scenes. And finally, I must also express my profound gratitude to Bernard and Almine Ruiz-Picasso and their foundation, FABA, for their essential support for this conference on top of everything else, all the wonderful things they've done for the museum. Bernard, thank you. So, one might sum up the theme of this conference by saying that we are here to discuss the role of history in Picasso's work beyond the well-known example of Guernica, the most famous and probably the most important painting of the 20th century. Guernica has been the subject of intense art historical study, beginning with Juan Laria's book of 1947 and Rudolf Arnheim's famous monograph of 1962. More recently, the great Argentinian scholar Andrea Junta convened a major conference in 2009 on Guernica and its effect on post-war art, a theme that was also explored in Genoveva Tucel's important book from 2017, El Guernica Recobrado. In 2017 and 2018, the Reina Sofia Museum in Madrid and the Museo Picasso Paris mounted important exhibitions devoted to the painting with significant catalogs, including brilliant new interpretations by T.J. Clark and Anne Wagner. You will note that the Congress program for today and the next 2 days does not include any papers on Guernica. Instead, we will follow in the footsteps of scholars who examined the role of history in Picasso's other work. Picasso, The Formative Years, published in 1962 by Anthony Blunt and Phoebe Poole, interprets Picasso's early work in light of social history. Perhaps this is less surprising now that we know the later revelation of Blunt's communist sympathies, which were not known at the time the book was published. Another important antecedent is Linda Nauckland's study of Picasso's color, published on the occasion of the Museum of Modern Art's historic Picasso retrospective of 1980. In particular, Nauckland examined Picasso's use of a tricolor palette of red, white, and blue, the colors of the French flag. My own talk today will return to this theme of the image of France in Picasso's work, calling on some of the same examples as Nauckland. Nauckland's article was followed in 1989 by Patricia Layton's groundbreaking Reordering the Universe, Picasso and Anarchism, 1897 to 1914. In an unfortunate historical turn of events, in the same year, semiological, in 1989, the semiological analysis became a kind of new orthodoxy in the study of Cubism, pushing social history into the shadows. And we are here today and tomorrow and the day after, to some extent, to reverse that process. Social history began to move back into the foreground with the publication in 1998 of David Cottington's Cubism in the Shadow of War, The Avant-Garde and Politics in Paris, 1905 to 14, and the publication in 2001 of Cubism and Culture, written by Layton with her husband, Mark Antliff. Happily, David Cottington is one of our speakers today. We had also hoped to have the participation of Leighton and Antliff, but family responsibilities, unfortunately, did not permit this. I would also like to mention inspiring examples of studies by Elizabeth Cowling and Christopher Green. The structure of this Congress has also been profoundly influenced by Michael Fitzgerald's seminal exhibition of 2007, Picasso and American Art, demonstrating that the meaning of Picasso's work lies as much in its effect on other artists as in its sources. Fitzgerald's exhibition was no doubt a model for Andrea Giunta's 2009 conference. I'm very happy to say that Michael Fitzgerald is participating in this Congress as a moderator and interlocutor. Following his example, we've invited talks on Picasso's influence as a model for socially conscious art in places including Spain, Germany, Eastern Europe, Latin America, Africa, and the Middle East. By the end of the day, on Thursday, we should be able to see the outlines of a new global Picasso. Let me now turn to my own topic, Picasso as history painter. I will begin with a brief reflection on the general question, what is history painting? I will then explore two particular themes demonstrating the presence of contemporary history in Picasso's work. First, the image of the 14 Juillet, Bastille Day, as a symbol not just of national identity, but also of left-wing political engagement. And second, the representation of labor in Picasso's work, revealing his concern with social issues, but also his relative detachment from politics prior to 1936. Poussin's importance for Picasso has been explored in a recent exhibition, Poussin, Le Massacre des Innocents, Picasso and Bacon, which was seen in Chantilly in 2017, organized by Émilie Bouvard and Laurent Lebon with Pierre Rosenberg. This relationship can be explored in terms of content and mood, building on the arguments of T.J. Clark in the Catalogue of Pity and Terror, Picasso's Path to Guernica. Here, Clark quotes the critic Judith Butler as arguing that shared vulnerability might be a source for creating a sense of social collectivity. We might see Poussin's abduction as an early emblem of this idea. The women, the victims in this painting, are the people who will later unite the Romans and the Sabines, as in the famous painting by Jacques-Louis David. However, Poussin's painting can also be interpreted as a model of what Leon Battista Alberti meant by history painting, when he coined the term in his 1435 treatise on painting. Here, Alberti emphasizes the pleasure produced by variety. He writes, "Copiousness and variety please in painting, which mixes old, young, maidens, women, youths, young boys, fowls, small dogs," always a favorite with Picasso, birds, horses, sheep, buildings, and landscapes. This copiousness should be embellished with a certain variety, yet moderate and grave with dignity and truth. I, that's Alberti, blame those painters who leave nothing vacant. What they produce is not composition, but dissolute confusion. Bodies in many dissimilar poses are always especially pleasing. There ought to be some nude, and others part nude and clothed. Be careful not to repeat the same gesture or pose. The Historia will move the soul of the beholder when each man painted there clearly shows the movement of his own soul. Now, Poussin's painting that we're looking at on screen as perhaps the determining example of history painting, or a determining example, introduces the idea, which is not found in Alberti, that confusion can and should be avoided by a deliberate repetition of gestures and alignment of forms. Picasso uses the same devices in Guernica. Perhaps it could be argued that his many variations on Cubism are also ways of achieving this same unity in variety. What I want to do now is to trace the way that Alberti's idea of Historia as variety becomes combined with the idea of painting that depicts contemporary events. Note that At the origin of history painting, it is not about history in our sense of politics and historical change. Rather, that idea is added later on. As Robert Rosenblum argued, the first history painting in this sense may have been Benjamin West's Death of General Wolfe, painted in 1770. English history painting provides an important model for Jacques-Louis David and is carried forward into the Romantic era by painters such as Théodore Géricault. Here we're looking, of course, at Géricault's Raft of the Medusa. And we find an extraordinarily complex figure group worthy of Poussin, a seascape and a horrifying narrative that indicted the corruption and incompetence of the Bourbon monarchy that had been restored to power in 1814. I think today we look at this painting and it has kind of Michelangelo-esque sense of horror and terror, but we don't necessarily remember that it is very much a painting about contemporary politics with a strong political message in its time. Like Picasso and Guernica, Géricault arranges his figures in and around a compositional pyramid outlined here by the mast and rigging of the raft. Now I'm turning to Eugène Delacroix, and in his masterpieces of the 1820s, Delacroix pushes history paintings in two different directions. As if returning to Alberti, his Massacre at Chios, on the left here, emphasizes variety and local color, seemingly at the expense of compositional unity, although in fact the painting is organized around a strong inverted pyramid. In Greece, on the ruins of Missolonghi, on the right, Delacroix throws away variety and complexity to focus on a single figure. He also abandons Géricault's aim of painting the actual participants in an historical event. Delacroix's figure in this painting is typical, but she is not an individual. She is an allegorical portrait of the Greek nation. I should add as a kind of footnote that T.J. Clark suggests, I'm sure correctly, that Picasso may have borrowed the image of the dead mother with her infant that we find in Guernica, from Delacroix's Massacre at Chios here on the lower right of the painting. However, it is in Greece on the ruins of Missolonghi that provides a more important model for Picasso, who most often uses allegory rather than narrative as a vehicle for history painting. This idea of allegory in history painting provides a path into my two substantive themes, beginning with Picasso's evocation of the 14 Juillet, a theme linked with both celebration and mourning. And I would like to acknowledge that it was Émilie Bouvard's great recent exhibition about Guernica that drew my attention to the drawing you see here on screen. As Hervé Senant explains in the catalog for her exhibition, the French Popular Front, elected in April 1936, staged a revival of Romain Rolland's 1901-1902 play, Le 14 Juillet, about the French Revolution and the storming of the Bastille. The new Popular Front government commissioned Picasso to design a stage curtain. His first thought, which is what we see here in this drawing, was to depict the angry crowd preparing to attack the royal fortress. Now, I've been reading Rolland's play, which is quite wonderful, and it's an interesting mixture. There are historical characters like Camille Desmoulins, Robespierre, Marat. There are anonymous representatives of the people or the working class. They're labeled that way in the script. I don't know if they had little signs when they came on stage. I doubt it. And there are also a few distinctly drawn individuals, two workers named Hoche and Hulin, who have a funny interchange, somewhat like Vladimir and Estragon in Waiting for Godot. And then there's a scheming bourgeois named Gonchon. Even the name sounds a little bit evil. These characters might well have been drawn by Daumier. One can easily imagine some wonderful lithographs with episodes from Rolland's play, although that is anachronistic. But this is, of course, not the kind of thing that Picasso did. And it seems that as beautiful as this drawing is, he rejected it and ultimately settled on another subject for his stage curtain, the famous image of the bird-headed man and the dying minotaur, which has been explored in important articles by scholars such as Sidra Stitch. But what I want to pick up on here, and now jump back in time, starting with this drawing titled the 14 Juillet, is to go back to the theme of the 14 Juillet, the 14th of July, which goes very, very early in Picasso's work. This is, of course, his painting of 1901, devoted to that image of this popular festival from the Guggenheim Museum. Here, Picasso depicts the popular dances that filled the streets on the 14th of July. It seems like a lighthearted theme. However, as the phrase we use in English, Bastille Day, reminds us, the image conveys an important political message. Throughout the 19th century, there had been a long debate in France about the revolution that began in 1789. Should it have stopped with the creation of a constitutional monarchy that happened in that same year? After the constitutional monarchy collapsed in 1792, which party had a better vision for France, the conservative Girondins or the radical Jacobins? Should the king have been executed in 1793? Did the invasion of France by other countries justify the reign of terror in 1793-94? And note that that reign of terror is the model for the subsequent ones that happened in Russia, China, and so forth. This has become a key feature of modern history. Was the revolutionary government justified in persecuting the Catholic Church? What judgment should be passed on the next government, the Directory, on the military decision, not just to defend France, but in fact to go out and to conquer other European nations, on the rise of Napoleon? What should be thought of all these events, all these decisions? These were a topic of lively debate throughout the 19th century. They were key defining features of French politics. In 1901, the year of Picasso's painting that you see on screen, the newly formed Radical Party took power, proclaiming its allegiance to the revolution as a bloc, as a totality, that they were in for the whole thing. They weren't going to say, we like this part, we don't like that part. The radicals also continued the revolutionary policy of persecuting the Catholic Church, confiscating all of the property of the French Church in 1905, 1906. Thus, Picasso's 1901 image of the dancers in the streets on the 14th of July can be seen, I think, in a less innocent way as a celebration of the people seizing control of public space. It offers a secular counterpart to the traditional carnival before Lent, during which a symbolic king and queen were elected from the working class, and common people were temporarily entitled to insult their social superiors. In most of Europe, this tradition came to an end during World War I, but it was still well and alive in 1901. Now I'm going to fast forward to 1912, and the drawing in the middle here, which shows two dancers, a couple dancing on July 14th, 1912. The image of the two dancers is probably inspired by paintings by Renoir, like the one on the left from 1883. But Picasso adds a new public and, in effect, political element by drawing in those little triangular flags overhead. He reminds us that this is not just two people having a wonderful romantic time, but is indeed part of a larger politically charged event. And if you look at the painting on the right, one of his great Cubist compositions of the summer and fall 1912, reworked at the beginning of 1913, you'll notice those little zigzagging triangular forms, which are, or seem to be, repetitions of the flags that we find in the drawing in the center here. In other words, there is a political note that returns in what might seem to be a completely apolitical still life. Now, the theme of the 14th of July is given a new inflection, of course, by other changes in the political realm. I'm thinking specifically of the years leading up to the outbreak of World War I. In contrast to the celebratory character of those 14 Juillet paintings and drawings, other works by Picasso evoke the threat of war, which was very much in the air by 1911. Let me just remind you of some key moments in the history of the era. In 1907, France, Britain, and Russia had signed the Triple Entente to try to contain the power of Germany. In spring 1911, the antagonism between France and Germany was reinforced by a conflict over colonial goals in Morocco. Even the French left, which had traditionally been strongly pacifist, was now swept up in a revival of nationalism, undoing the anti-military sentiments that had been inspired by the Dreyfus Affair. On March 27, 1911, Picasso's close friend and collaborator at this moment, Georges Braque, was called up for 17 days of military service. And in the photograph on the left here, you see Braque seated in Picasso's studio wearing his military greatcoat. 6 months later, when Braque was in Céret in southwest France, he wrote to his dealer Kahnweiler to say, "There's a lot of talk about war these days. I hope that neither war nor famine will take the palette from my hand." Note that this is in 1911. Reacting to Picasso's military service, Picasso painted a picture, now lost, showing a soldier wooing a girl by playing a guitar. So that's what you see in the drawing in the center, and the black and white photograph from the Kahnweiler archives of the now lost painting on the right here. The traditional theme of the soldier as lover seems designed to repress a very real anxiety about the possibility of war. This was a widely shared feeling. Describing Paris in these years, the Russian writer Ilya Ehrenberg comments that at the Rotonde, a cafe favored by Picasso and the other artists, quote, "A sense of catastrophe was served to every customer along with his cup of coffee." In the spring of 1912, the brothers André and Édouard Michelin, who had made a fortune selling automobile tires, published a book, which you see on the left, arguing that France needed an air force to ensure its military supremacy. And it seems notable that in one of his first paintings using Ripolin enamels, Picasso reproduced the red, white, and blue cover of this book and its title, Notre avenir est dans l'air. The art historical literature on these paintings stresses the use of Ripolin, which was a strongly non-artistic paint. There's a very nice anecdote in Picasso's letters back and forth with Kahnweiler, where Kahnweiler writes to Picasso and says, "Well, Wilhelm Ude came in and he saw your paintings with Ripolin and he was absolutely furious." And you must recall that Ude had been one of Picasso's greatest patrons in the previous years, a supporter of Cubism at a moment when very few people were in favor of it in 1910. So now Picasso has really, really irritated this great supporter of his work, and Picasso writes back to Kahnweiler, "Oh, well, we pissed off Ude. That's terrific. Maybe we can piss off everybody else too." So there's that classic Picasso sense of humor. But to come back to the particular painting reproducing the cover of this book, I wouldn't say that it represents an endorsement of the arguments of the Michelin brothers, but it certainly makes it clear that these issues were in Picasso's mind, that they were in the air of the public sphere, and they were something Picasso was thinking about. This brings me to, of course, one of his most famous collages, guitar, glass, and sheet music from the fall of 1912. This incorporates a newspaper headline announcing the outbreak of the First Balkan War in October 1912. Lasting until May 1913, the war pitted the Balkan League, which was Bulgaria, Serbia, Greece, and Montenegro, against the Ottoman Empire. After it ended, it was followed a month later by the Second Balkan War, in which Bulgaria attacked Serbia and Greece, attempting to get more territory. They didn't like the division that had been agreed on at the end of the First War. In this case, Bulgaria was supported by Germany, while Serbia was supported by Russia. By August 1913, Bulgaria had lost the Second Balkan War. But it was now clear how a conflict in a seemingly obscure region of Europe could lead to war among the major powers, with France and England coming to the aid of Russia against Germany and Austria-Hungary. This is, of course, exactly what happened a year later in 1914. The generals on both sides expected a short, decisive conflict like the Franco-Prussian War of 1870. What occurred instead was a long, indecisive war of attrition, causing more death and suffering than any previous war in human history. Brock was called up for military service. You see him with a bandage on his head at left, while Apollinaire enlisted as a volunteer. Both of them suffered serious head wounds, as you see in the photograph and in this drawing by Picasso. And of course, Apollinaire, although he survived his wound, was weakened and fell victim to the Spanish influenza a few years later. It is in this context of the war that I think we should interpret and we should understand Picasso's mannerist drawing of a crucifixion, whose dating is uncertain, somewhere between 1915 and 1918. It seems to me essentially an image of the French nation tormented by the horrors of war. And I think that this tendency to take history and translate it into religious terms is an important factor in Picasso's work going forward. The trauma of the war is also visible in Picasso's 1915 drawing of a dancing couple, which you see on the left here. Despite the woman's boldly striped skirt of blue and black stripes, the browns and blacks of the dance floor and the surrounding room evoke a morbid atmosphere, which is at the extreme opposite from his 1901 and 1912 depictions of dancers. Picasso compressed these two separate figures into a single figure, his painting of a tragic harlequin, completed in December 1915. Now, at the time that he finished this painting, his lover, Eva Guel, was dying in a suburban clinic, and he wrote a heart-rending letter to Gertrude Stein saying, "My life is sheer hell. I spend hours every day taking the bus to see Eva and coming back again. It's awful." And then he pauses and goes, "And I'm doing a painting of a harlequin. People tell me it's the best thing I've ever done." This leads to a question about the dating of the drawing. One might imagine it was done at the end of the year, close to the date of the painting in December, but my guess is that it may have been done in the previous summer, that it is another July 14th drawing, and that it records the fact that you could no longer have a joyous celebration of the 14 Juillet. So there's a mixture here, or a merger, of the personal tragedy of Eva's illness and the more general background of universal suffering due to the war. Even in 1921, 3 years after the end of the war, Picasso's depiction of a country dance colored in a patriotic palette of red, white, and blue, and this is one of the images discussed by Linda Nochlin, remains uncharacteristically solemn. France had suffered almost 1,400,000 war dead. Because peasants were more likely to be drafted than were factory workers or businessmen, these losses were concentrated among the rural population. If the man in Picasso's painting is a veteran of the war, he is a lucky survivor. Many of his friends would have been killed or have lost limbs in the fighting. And it seems to me that this traumatic experience is part of the foundation, the background to this painting. There is a similar tragic atmosphere enveloping the figures in Picasso's Reading a Letter from 1921-22, which, even though it's done after the war, seems to me to evoke the experience of men who have remained at home on the farm, reading a letter from their brothers who are fighting and dying in the trenches of World War I. Now, I have introduced an anachronistic comparison here, a socialist realist painting depicting a Russian family reading a letter from the front. We know that the reality, this is from 1947. Now, the reality of what happened to Russian soldiers in the Second World War was absolutely as terrible as what happened to French soldiers in the First World War. But the rules of socialist realism and Soviet propaganda, and here I should tip a hat, I suppose, to the extraordinary exhibition, The Radiant Future, here at the Russian Museum here in Malaga. In any case, the rules of Soviet propaganda dictated that the letter must seem to convey positive news, that the real horror of the experience of the Russian army could not be shown in a painting, whereas I believe that in a sense the tragedy of the French experience is shown in Picasso's painting. Now, I want now to leave behind the theme of nationalism and patriotism and turn instead to Picasso's representations of labor. Patricia Layton and other scholars have firmly established Picasso's early sympathy with anarchism as a political doctrine. What perhaps needs to be emphasized as well is his empathy with the experience of physical labor, particularly the labor of women. Looking back at the visual culture of the 18th and 19th centuries, it is evident that the images of working women could be deployed for very different purposes, from the paintings of Fragonard to the drawings of Paul Gavarnis, such as you see on the left here. The laundress, often shown in a state of partial undress, she's taken off her blouse, revealing a kind of undershirt, becomes a figure of erotic fantasy. In contrast, the laundresses of Edgar Degas, which you see in the center, are shown in poses that emphasize their hard physical labor and their fatigue. And it seems to me notable that in his 1904 painting, Woman Ironing, which you see on the right, Picasso follows Degas' example, using Mannerist distortion of the figure to emphasize the physical effort necessary to iron a shirt. It should be noted, however, that Picasso's interest in labor, his empathy here at a personal level, is not matched by any perceptible interest in the labor movement at this time as a political phenomenon. 1906, for instance, was a year of massive protest. 438,000 workers went on strike for an extended period. Now, in researching this paper, I've learned that the sociologists have a good way of creating a metric for strikes. They take the number of people on strike and multiply it by the number of days they go on strike. And with that method, we can say that French workers of this era typically went on strike for around 1.5 million days per year collectively. In 1906, they were on strike for a total of 9.5 million days. This was a year of massive protest. They struck to demand an 8-hour working day and to protest a mining disaster that had caused 1,200 deaths. The Minister of the Interior at this time was Georges Clemenceau. Although he had entered politics as a leftist, he now used the police and the army to crush the strikes. The result was a dramatic defeat for the French labor movement. As far as I can tell, there is no trace of these events in Picasso's work of 1906. Rather, it is at this time that he begins to focus on the erotic themes that will culminate in the Demoiselles d'Avignon of 1907 and the Three Women of 1908. So there is an important question here about the, I suppose you could call them pendulum swings of Picasso's engagement with questions of labor, at certain moments intensely engaged, at others apparently disengaged. I'm now then going to fast forward from 1904 to the early 1920s and pick up with the question of the representation of labor, not just in Picasso's work, but in other work of this era, notably that of Fernand Léger. So on the left here, I'm showing you Léger's Mechanic of 1920. On the right, his Three Women of 1921. Part of the background to these paintings by Léger lies in the war years. Most of France's industry before World War I was located in the country's northeast, and most of this industry was destroyed by the Germans during the war. New and more modern factories were rebuilt in the Paris region, making the phenomenon of industrialization much more visible to artists, avant-garde artists based in Paris. Léger, in particular, was profoundly influenced by the image of the modern factory. Now, for Léger, as you will all recall, the war was both a nightmare and a revelation. Bombarded by artillery, sprayed with machine gun fire, he nonetheless strangely admired the sheer power of the machine. That was oddly his takeaway from the war, that there was something glorious about machines. After the war, he thought the machine would remake civilian society as thoroughly as it had remade warfare. The mechanic at left thus becomes the exemplary figure of the post-war era. And this is, of course, not an idea limited to Léger. We find it, for instance, in George Grosz and John Hartfield and the image of the mechanic in Berlin Dada. In Léger's visual imagination, as we see it right, industrialization infiltrates even the fantasy world of the boudoir. The poses of his three women recall Delacroix's Women of Algiers, but the women themselves are reduced to cylindrical, machine-like forms. Well, how did Picasso respond to this new industrialized form of labor? In the same year, 1921, that Léger paints his mechanical three women, Picasso also paints three women, but they are clothed in classical garments and placed in a rural setting. At first glance, then, it might seem that Picasso is turning his back on contemporary reality. However, I would argue that Picasso is providing a more accurate picture of contemporary France than Léger is. The reality is that despite the new Parisian factories, France was very slow to industrialize. The urban population of France did not equal the rural population until 1931. Léger's industrial France was, I think, a dream, not a reality. And here I would like to re-examine Picasso's painting, The Milliners Workshop, from 1936. This is a painting that is often overlooked in the literature on Picasso, as though scholars don't really know what to say about it. When they do write about it these days, or in recent decades, they generally interpret it in biographical terms. There has been this huge shift towards biography, and part of our goal for these 3 days is to move beyond that. So it gets interpreted as an image of the household of Marie-Thérèse Voltaire, with Picasso himself entering through the door at the right on his way to a romantic appointment, and the three figures in the center and left are Marie-Thérèse, her sister, and her mother. Picasso's story, his original story, that the painting was inspired by the view from his window across the street into the apartment on the opposite side of the street, where he saw three women making hats. This story seems to be dismissed merely as a kind of cover story for the more exciting romantic tale. But let's imagine instead that both stories are true. I'm not saying the biographical one is untrue, but that they might both be true, that the painting is a fusion of these two ideas or these two narratives. So then the Milliners Workshop depicts three women in the garment industry making hats at home. This seems embarrassingly old-fashioned. The theme recalls Degas' millinery shop of around 1880. But is it therefore a less accurate depiction of contemporary French industry than the assembly line utopia evoked by Léger? In fact, French industry in the 1920s remained relatively artisanal. Large American-style factories like those of André Citroën and Louis Renault attracted attention precisely because they were unusual in France. It's difficult, at least for an art historian, it's difficult to find employment statistics for the mid-1920s, but it seems likely that in 1926, about 35% of French workers in general and about 73% of working women were still in the textile or garment business. Perhaps 50% of French industry still consisted of small workshops. It might be argued then that the Milliners Workshop, Picasso's painting, offers a more representative view of French industry than do the mechanical paintings of Léger. Now, in terms of form, the Milliners Workshop is a history painting in the tradition of Poussin's abduction of the Sabine women, a complex scene with multiple figures infused with dynamic energy, but nonetheless combined into a unified, harmonious composition. The idea of unifying figures and background within a system of interlocking curves, interlacing curves, looks back to Picasso's revolutionary Three Women of 1908. However, the sinuous, erotic quality of the curves in the Milliners Workshop probably reflects the more immediate stimulus of André Masson's automatic drawings of 1924-25, one of the starting points for surrealism. They would, in turn, the curves of Picasso's painting, that is, provide a model for the interlacing webs of Jackson Pollock. The great German critic Karl Einstein, and here I have to thank Charles Haxthausen, who allowed me to see the manuscript of his forthcoming book and translation of Einstein's essays, Einstein described Picasso's like this one as combining architectonic order with instinctual drives. This seems to me an exemplary formula for the avant-garde history painting of the mid-20th century. Like Guernica, it would infuse the representation of contemporary history with violence and desire, expressed by form rather than by conventional narrative. The debates around Guernica have often raised the question of whether the eroticized character of the figures, borrowing from Picasso's earlier work, contradicts or distracts from the painting's political message. Let us remember, that was dramatic. Do we know what that is? Oh, it's telling me I'm out of time. Well, if you don't mind, voice of God up there, another 15 seconds. Let us remember, however, that the passionate quality of political discourse on both left and right is often rooted in fantasies of wholeness, purity, and contentment, or in fantasies of injury, pollution, and revenge that have more to do with psychology than with historical fact. If people so often vote against their own economic interest, it is not because they are idiots. It is because politicians are skilled in describing reality in emotional rather than rational terms. Picasso's surrealist imagery, charged with desire and violence, is exactly the right vehicle to represent the phenomenology of politics. Thank you.